My name is Alina Smith. I'm 32 years old. And the final words my father spoke to me were that I'd never achieve anything beyond being some enlisted soldier taking orders in the wilderness. That was 3 years ago at my grandmother's memorial service, when he announced to our entire extended family that his disappointing daughter had squandered her life pretending to be a warrior instead of pursuing the medical career he'd envisioned. What he remained unaware of, what none of them comprehended, was that 2 weeks earlier, I'd received a classified briefing from the Secretary of Defense regarding an operation that would revolutionize intelligence collection in the Middle East. But I'm moving too quickly. The telephone call arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was analyzing surveillance data in my office at Fort Meade. My cousin Maria's voice carried barely restrained terror. "Alina, you need to return home immediately." "What's happened?" "It's your father. He's been taken into custody." The statement struck me like Arctic water. My father, Colonel David Smith, retired, the man who'd devoted my entire childhood to instilling discipline and integrity within me. The man who'd disavowed me for selecting military intelligence over medical school, was confined in a federal detention facility in El Paso, facing charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. "That's inconceivable," I responded. But even as those words escaped my lips, fragments were assembling themselves. His unexpected affluence following retirement, the new residence, the luxury vehicles, the journeys to nations that should have triggered warnings for any former military officer. "Alina, you must assist him. You're employed by the government, correct? Can't you place some calls?" I shut my eyes. If only she understood what type of calls I could initiate. "I'll arrive tomorrow." The journey to El Paso provided me 12 hours to contemplate and 12 hours to recall why I'd remained absent so long. My father had been a distinguished officer, someone I'd idolized as a child. But when I'd decided to follow his path, though in intelligence rather than infantry, he'd perceived it as a betrayal of his aspirations for my future. "You're squandering your intellect," he'd declared when I'd graduated from West Point. "Intelligence work, that's for people who can't manage genuine responsibility." When I'd achieved captain at 26, he'd scarcely acknowledged it. When I'd earned my first commendation for work I couldn't even describe to him, he'd shifted the conversation. And when I'd finally attained my majority and attempted to share my pride with him, he'd regarded me with something approaching disgust. 30 years old, and you're still merely following orders. When will you mature and assume control of your own existence? That had been our final meaningful conversation before the funeral incident. He'd presented me to distant relatives as my daughter, who's still attempting to discover herself in the army. When I tried to correct him, to explain that I wasn't simply in the army anymore, he dismissed me with visible embarrassment. "Alina, please. We all understand you're not exactly ascending any hierarchies over there." If only he'd realized that 3 months earlier, I'd been elevated to lieutenant colonel and assigned leadership of a joint task force responsible for counterintelligence operations across 7 countries. If only he'd known that senators contacted me for briefings, that 4-star generals sought my analysis, that my security clearance was so elevated that most of my own family couldn't even know which building housed my office. But I'd never informed him, partly due to classification requirements, but primarily because his dismissal had wounded so deeply that I'd ceased attempting to earn his respect. The federal courthouse in El Paso stood as a monument to institutional authority, all marble and glass and the gravity of justice. I'd been in structures like this previously, but always as the person conducting briefings, never as someone whose personal life had intersected with the machinery of federal law enforcement. My family had assembled in the lobby like survivors of a catastrophe. Maria was present with her husband, along with my Aunt Carmen, my Uncle Roberto, and a handful of cousins I barely recognized. They looked up when I entered, and I observed the familiar combination of hope and condescension in their expressions. "Alina," Maria hurried over. "Thank heavens you're here. Did you bring someone from your job? Someone who can assist?" "I brought myself." Uncle Roberto stepped forward. "Mija, no offense, but we require someone with genuine authority here. Someone who can actually accomplish something." "Such as who?" "Like someone who understands how these matters function, someone with connections." "You mentioned you work in intelligence, correct? Can you contact your supervisor?" I nearly smiled. Let me discover what I can learn first. The truth was I'd already initiated calls during my layover in Dallas. Not to my supervisor, I was the supervisor of my division, but to colleagues at Justice, at State, at agencies whose names I couldn't mention in mixed company. My father's case was already on my desk in Maryland, had been for 6 months, and I'd been the one to personally authorize the surveillance that resulted in his arrest. The irony was so acrid, I could taste it. We waited for 4 hours. For hours of my family pacing, speculating, and occasionally remembering to inquire about my insignificant government position with the distracted courtesy people reserve for discussing someone's pastime. Maria's husband kept checking his phone and muttering about attorneys. Aunt Carmen recited her rosary. Uncle Roberto told anyone who'd listen that this was all an error, that David Smith was a patriot who'd served his country for 30 years. He would never betray America, he kept declaring. This is persecution. I remained silent, but I knew better. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, encrypted communications, meetings with foreign nationals, classified documents discovered in his home office. My father hadn't just betrayed his country. He'd done it carelessly, arrogantly, as if his reputation alone would shield him. At 4:30, a federal prosecutor named Jennifer Walsh emerged from the elevator and scanned the lobby until her gaze found me. "Miss Smith, could I speak with you privately?" My family tensed. Maria grasped my arm. "Should we accompany you?" "No," Walsh said firmly. "Just Miss Smith." We proceeded to a small conference room where Walsh secured the door and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "This is highly irregular," she began, "but given your position, I wanted to speak with you before the arraignment." "My position?" "Colonel Smith, please. We both understand why you're truly here." The title struck the room like a physical force. I hadn't been addressed as colonel by anyone in my family's presence since my promotion 8 months ago. Classification requirements meant I remained lieutenant colonel on paper for most purposes, but my operational rank was full colonel, and my authority extended far beyond what most people could imagine. "What do you need to know?" I asked. "Did you know about your father's activities?" "Not until 6 months ago when my office flagged the financial anomalies. I recused myself from the operation once we identified him." "But you didn't warn him." "It wasn't a question. We both knew I couldn't have warned him, even if I'd wanted to. But the truth was more complicated than that." "No," I said quietly. "I didn't warn him." Walsh nodded and opened a file. "The evidence is overwhelming. Financial records show payments totaling $2.3 million over 18 months. We have photographs, recorded conversations, and classified documents recovered from his residence. He's going to prison, Colonel. The only question is for how long." "What are you asking me?" "Nothing. I'm telling you that in about 20 minutes, your father is going to be arraigned on charges that carry a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Your family is going to be devastated, and you're going to have to decide whether to tell them who you really are or let them keep thinking you're just some low-level government employee who couldn't help if she wanted to." I stared at her. "Are you enjoying this?" "Honestly? A little. Your father has spent the last 3 days telling anyone who'd listen that his daughter works for the government and will straighten this mess out. He seems to think you're some kind of secretary or analyst who can make phone calls and fix things. He has no idea that you're the person who authorized the investigation that put him here." The words were like a blow to the stomach, but I kept my expression neutral. "Anything else?" "Just this. When we arrested him, he asked if we'd contacted his daughter. He said, and I quote, 'Alina might not be much, but she works for you people. She can tell you this is all a mistake.'" I closed my eyes and felt something inside me finally shatter. When we returned to the lobby, my family surrounded me with desperate questions. "What did she say? Can you help? Do you know someone?" I looked at their faces, hopeful, frightened, completely unaware that the person they were pleading with for help was the same person who'd helped construct the case against my father. "The evidence is very serious," I said carefully. "But you can do something, right?" Maria pressed. "You can call someone. There's going to be an arraignment in a few minutes. You should prepare yourselves." Uncle Roberto stepped closer. "Alina, I know you're just what do you do exactly?" "Something with computers." "Something like that, right? Well, I know you're not high up or anything, but surely someone you work with has connections. Real connections." The courtroom was packed. Federal cases involving espionage don't occur often in El Paso, and the local media had caught wind of the story. I sat in the back row with my family, watching as my father was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. When his eyes found mine in the gallery, he actually smiled, a weak, desperate expression that broke my heart and filled me with rage simultaneously. The charges were read: conspiracy to commit espionage, violation of the Espionage Act, conspiracy to transmit national defense information to a foreign government. Each count carried decades in prison. My father's attorney entered a plea of not guilty and then requested bail consideration, citing his military service and strong family ties to the community. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, rising to respond, "Mr. Smith poses an extreme flight risk. The government has evidence that he has contacts in multiple foreign countries and access to resources that could facilitate his disappearance. We request he be held without bail." "I'll hear arguments," the judge said. For 20 minutes, lawyers argued about my father's character, his service record, his ties to the community. His attorney painted him as a patriot who dedicated his life to his country. The prosecutor painted him as a traitor who'd sold out that same country for money. Neither of them mentioned that his daughter was sitting 30 feet away. Finally, the judge called for a recess to consider bail. As the courtroom began to empty, my family huddled around me. "This is insane," Maria whispered. "He's not a spy. He's not a traitor." "The evidence," I began. "The evidence is wrong," Uncle Roberto snapped. "And you should be doing something about it instead of just sitting here. Call your supervisor. Call someone with authority. This is your father. You think I haven't tried?" The lie came easily. "Then try harder." "Jesus, Alina, what's the point of working for the government if you can't help your own family?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw 32 years of dismissed achievements, unacknowledged sacrifices, and casual condescension crystallized in his impatient expression. He was speaking to me the same way my father always had, the same way my family always had, like I was a child playing dress-up in an adult's job. "You're right," I said quietly. "Let me make a call." I walked to the courthouse steps and pulled out my phone. Not to make a call. I'd already made all the calls that mattered, but to check my messages. 17 new emails, including one from the deputy director asking for my assessment of the weekend's intelligence briefing, and another from a Senate subcommittee requesting my testimony on emerging cyber threats. When I returned to the courtroom, my family was clustered in the hallway, whispering frantically among themselves. They looked up as I approached. "Well," Maria asked. "I spoke with my supervisor," I said, and I paused, looking at their faces. My aunt, who'd always introduced me as Alina, who works for the government, doing something with computers. My uncle, who'd spent Christmas dinner 3 years ago explaining to me how real jobs worked. My cousins who'd never thought to ask what I actually did for a living beyond something in intelligence. As if intelligence were a single, simple thing that people like me did in cubicles somewhere. He said there's nothing anyone can do. The evidence is overwhelming. The words hit them like a physical blow. Maria started crying. Uncle Roberto cursed in Spanish. Aunt Carmen resumed her rosary. But I wasn't finished. "Actually," I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. He said something else. They turned to me with desperate hope. He said my father's case is being handled by some of the highest levels of government, national security implications. He said the person running the investigation is someone with serious authority. "Who?" Roberto demanded. "Can you contact them?" "I already have." The courtroom doors opened, and people began filing back in. As we took our seats, I saw my father searching the gallery until he found my face. He mouthed something that looked like, "Help me." I mouthed back, "I love you." The judge returned, and the room fell silent. After considering the arguments and reviewing the evidence, he began. "This court finds that the defendant poses a significant flight risk and danger to national security. Bail is denied." My father's shoulders slumped. Behind me, Maria sobbed audibly. "However," the judge continued, "before we adjourn, I have an unusual request. The prosecution has asked that a particular individual be acknowledged for their role in this investigation." I felt ice form in my stomach. This individual's identity cannot be fully disclosed due to classification requirements, but their work in identifying and investigating Mr. Smith's activities represents the highest caliber of service to our country. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to recognize the lead investigator whose analysis and supervision made this case possible." "Proceed." "Colonel Alina Smith, United States Army Intelligence and Security Command." The name echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. I felt every head turn toward me, felt my family's confused stares like physical weight. My father's face went white, his mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Colonel Smith, the judge said, looking directly at me. Would you please stand? My legs felt like water, but I stood. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Colonel, on behalf of this court and our country, thank you for your service and for your dedication to national security, even under personally difficult circumstances. I nodded once, unable to speak. You may be seated. As I sat down, I could feel my family's eyes on me like laser beams. Maria was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. Uncle Roberto's mouth was hanging open, and Carmen had dropped her rosary. But it was my father's expression that I'll remember forever. Not anger, not betrayal, but something worse. Recognition. The slow, dawning realization that the daughter he'd dismissed and underestimated had been the one to destroy him. The judge was speaking again, setting dates and procedures. But I wasn't listening. I was watching my father's face as the full weight of what had happened settled over him. When the proceedings ended and he was led away, he turned back one more time. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw something I'd never seen in his face before. Respect. Terrible, too late respect. Outside the courthouse, my family surrounded me in a circle of shock and accusation. You're a colonel? Maria's voice was barely a whisper. Yes. A colonel in Army intelligence. Yes. You investigated your own father. My office flagged his activities. I recused myself from direct involvement once we identified him. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head. You've been lying to us for years. I've been protecting classified information. There's a difference. You let us think you were nobody, Maria shouted. You let us think you were some low level. You never asked, I said quietly. In 15 years, none of you ever asked what I actually did. You assumed, and I let you assume because it was easier than watching you not care about the real answer. Aunt Carmen was crying now. You could have helped him. You could have warned him. No, I said firmly. I couldn't have. That would have been treason. He's your father, and I'm a United States Army officer. My oath is to the Constitution, not to family members who commit espionage. The words hung in the air like a condemnation. Maria wiped her eyes. So what now? You just go back to your important job and pretend this never happened. I looked at her, at all of them, and felt the weight of 32 years of being underestimated finally lift from my shoulders. No, I said. Now I go back to my job and continue serving my country just like I always have, just like I always will. I walked away from them, walked away from the family that had never seen me clearly enough to understand who I really was. As I reached my rental car, I heard Maria call out behind me. Alina, wait. I turned. I'm sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. We didn't know. I know, I said. But that's not my fault. On the flight back to Maryland, I thought about my father's face in that courtroom. The shock, the recognition, the terrible understanding that his disappointing daughter had been living a life he couldn't even imagine while he'd been selling secrets to foreign governments. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just the quiet, awful knowledge that sometimes the people who claim to love us see us least clearly of all. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Somehow my father had gotten access to a phone in detention. I never knew, it read. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I stared at the message for a long time. Then typed back, I know. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just acknowledgement. The thing I'd been waiting for my entire life, arriving 20 years too late and costing us both everything. But as the plane carried me back to my real life, to my real work, to the place where people knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, I realized something important. I didn't need their recognition anymore. I had never needed it. I had always been exactly who I was supposed to be. They just hadn't been looking hard enough to see.